The December wind cut through Central Park like a blade, but Danny Reeves barely felt it anymore. After 3 nights sleeping rough near the Bow Bridge, his body had adapted to the cold the way it once adapted to the scorching heat of Kandahar. His German Shepherd Ranger pressed closer against him on the bench, the dog's body heat the only warmth Danny had allowed himself to depend on in the 2 years since he'd returned from Afghanistan. This is the story of a veteran and his dog who spent Christmas in Central Park and discovered a secret under the snow that would change not just their lives, but the lives of countless others who had been forgotten by the city that never sleeps. It's a tale of hidden histories, underground networks, and the kind of Christmas miracle that happens when people choose to see the invisible among us. If you're ready for this incredible journey through the hidden heart of New York City, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story like this one. Danny pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders, watching the early morning joggers pass by without seeing him. He'd become good at being invisible. It was easier than explaining how a decorated army ranger had ended up homeless in the greatest city in the world. Easier than admitting that the skills that had kept him alive in combat zones were useless in civilian life. Easier than facing the fact that the nightmares and panic attacks had cost him his job, his apartment, and almost everyone he'd ever cared about. Ranger whined softly, his way of saying they needed to move before the park security made their morning rounds. Danny had learned the patterns over the past 3 months since he'd started sleeping in the park. 5:30 a.m. near the Bow Bridge, 6:15 by the Alice in Wonderland statue, 7 at the Bethesda Fountain, where tourists would start gathering and occasionally drop money in his direction, if Ranger performed a few of his military training tricks. But this morning was different. December 23rd, and the park was covered in a thick blanket of snow that had fallen overnight. Danny's usual spots were buried, and more importantly, the soup kitchen on West 86th would be closed for the next 3 days for Christmas. He had $47 to his name, a can of dog food for Ranger, half a bottle of water, and no plan for surviving the holiday. As they made their way through the snow-covered paths, Ranger suddenly stopped, his ears perked, body rigid in the way Danny recognized from their time in Afghanistan. It was the dog's alert posture, the one that had saved Danny's life more than once by detecting IEDs before they could detonate. "What is it, boy?" Danny whispered, scanning the area. They were near the Ramble, the wooded section of Central Park that most people avoided in the early morning. Ranger pulled toward a cluster of rocks partially hidden by overgrown vegetation and accumulated snow. The dog began digging frantically, something he never did without reason. Danny helped clear the snow, his fingers numbing quickly without gloves. What they uncovered made no sense. It was a metal grate, like a ventilation shaft, but it was warm to the touch. Heat was rising from below, enough to melt the snow around it. And there was something else, the faint sound of machinery, or maybe voices coming from deep underground. Ranger pawed at the grate, whimpering with an urgency Danny had rarely seen. Using his knife, one of the few possessions he'd kept from his military days, Danny worked at the edges of the grate. It was designed to look permanent, but was actually hinged, secured with a lock that had rusted through. With effort, he managed to pry it open. A ladder descended into darkness, but warm air rose to meet them, carrying with it the smell of coffee, food, and something else. Hope. Danny knew he should walk away. His military training screamed that entering unknown underground spaces was dangerous, potentially fatal. But Ranger was already starting down the ladder, and Danny had learned to trust the dog's instincts more than his own. The ladder went down about 20 feet, ending in a narrow tunnel lit by string lights. The walls were stone, old stone, possibly dating back centuries. Danny followed the tunnel, Ranger leading the way, until it opened into something impossible. It was a vast underground chamber, easily the size of a basketball court, filled with what looked like a fully functioning community. There were sections divided by hanging curtains and salvaged furniture, a kitchen area with camp stoves and stockpiled food, sleeping quarters with actual beds, a medical station with basic supplies, and people, at least 30 of them, all looking at Danny with expressions ranging from surprise to suspicion. An elderly black man stepped forward, his bearing immediately recognizable as military, despite his civilian clothes. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Ranger, you actually found him." Danny's hand went instinctively to his knife. "You know my dog?" The man smiled. "I know both of you, Sergeant Reeves. I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, retired, and you're standing in what we call the Underground Railroad 2. Zero, though that's not quite accurate. We've been watching you for weeks, waiting for the right time to make contact. Ranger just expedited the process." "Watching me?" Danny's mind raced, calculating escape routes, defensive positions. "Why?" "Because you're not the only veteran sleeping rough in this city, son. Not by a long shot. And because your dog there is special in ways you don't fully understand yet. But first, you look like you could use some coffee and a hot meal. Then we'll explain everything." Against his better judgment, Danny allowed himself to be led deeper into the underground space. The chamber connected to other tunnels, creating a network beneath Central Park that seemed to stretch in multiple directions. As they walked, Colonel Webb explained, "This place has existed in various forms since the 1860s. Started as a hideout for deserters from the Civil War, then became a station on the actual Underground Railroad. During the Depression, it housed hundreds of homeless veterans from World War I. Vietnam vets found it in the 70s. Now it's our turn." They entered a smaller chamber set up as a communal dining area. The smell of eggs and bacon made Danny's stomach clench with hunger. A woman with prosthetic legs, clearly military from her bearing, handed him a plate without asking if he wanted it. "Captain Lisa Chen, Army Medical Corps," she introduced herself. "Lost these in an IED attack outside Kabul. Now I run the medical station here. Eat first, questions later." Danny ate mechanically, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. Ranger was already being fed by another veteran, a young man missing his left arm, who seemed to know exactly how the dog liked his ears scratched. The level of organization was military in its precision. Everyone had a role, a purpose, a place. "How is this possible?" Danny finally asked. "How does the city not know about this?" Colonel Webb sat across from him, his expression serious. "Oh, some people know, the right people. People who understand that sometimes the best way to help is to look the other way. This network has saved thousands of veterans over the decades. We provide temporary shelter, medical care, job training, whatever's needed to get people back on their feet, all funded by veterans who made it out and want to give back." "But there's more," Captain Chen added. "Show him the archives, Colonel." Webb hesitated, then nodded. "You were an Army Ranger, Sergeant Reeves. You've seen classified materials before. What you're about to see is technically not classified because officially it doesn't exist, but it's just as sensitive." They led Danny through another tunnel, this one older, with walls that showed tool marks from hand excavation. It opened into a chamber filled with filing cabinets, boxes, and what looked like museum displays. The walls were covered with photographs, documents, and maps. "Every veteran who's passed through here since 1865, Webb explained. Their stories, their struggles, their successes. But more than that, we've documented something else, something that might sound crazy until you see the evidence." He pulled out a thick folder labeled Operation Hometown and opened it. Inside were documents that made Danny's blood run cold. CIA memos, Pentagon briefings, medical records. They detailed a program from the 1970s through the 1990s, where certain veterans were deliberately made homeless as part of psychological experiments on PTSD and social reintegration. "They used us as lab rats," Webb said bitterly. "Tested how much trauma a person could take before breaking completely, how society would respond to visible veteran homelessness." whether certain drugs could erase combat memories. Hundreds of veterans were affected. Many didn't survive. Danny read through the documents, his anger building with each page. Names, dates, locations, veterans who'd been drugged, manipulated, abandoned, and at the bottom of each file, the same signature, General Thomas Morrison, who'd later become a senator and was now being considered for Secretary of Defense. "This is why you brought me here," Danny said. "You want me to do something about this." "Not just you," Chen corrected. "Look at this." She pulled out another file, this one labeled Ranger Program. Inside were documents about military working dogs, specifically those trained for detection work in Afghanistan and Iraq. According to the files, certain dogs had been given experimental treatments to enhance their sensing abilities. The program had been discontinued, but the dogs retained heightened capabilities. Ranger was part of this program, Webb explained. He can sense things others can't. Not just explosives or drugs, but chemical signatures in humans. PTSD changes brain chemistry. Ranger can identify veterans in distress from hundreds of yards away. That's how he found this place. That's how he's been finding others. Danny looked at Ranger, who was sitting calmly beside him, and suddenly understood. All those times in Afghanistan, when Ranger had seemed to know things he couldn't possibly know. The way the dog had led him to certain spots in Central Park where other veterans gathered. The way Ranger always knew when Danny's nightmares were about to start. "We've been using dogs from the program to find veterans in need," Webb continued. "Bringing them here, helping them recover, building our network. But we've reached a critical point. Morrison is about to be confirmed as Secretary of Defense. If he gets that position, he'll have the power to bury this forever and potentially restart the experiments." "What do you need from me?" Danny asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Your testimony," Webb said. "You were in Kandahar when some of the later experiments were conducted. You saw things, documented things. We know you kept copies of certain reports." Danny's mind flashed back to Afghanistan, to the strange orders that had come down. The civilians' contractors who'd asked too many questions about his unit's mental health, the drugs they'd been required to take for malaria prevention that had caused hallucinations and memory gaps in half his squad. He'd made copies of everything, sensing something was wrong, and hidden them in a storage unit in Brooklyn that he'd managed to keep paid up, even while homeless. "Even if I testify," Danny said, "who's going to believe a homeless veteran against a general and senator?" "You won't be alone," Chen said. She led them to another chamber, where Danny saw something that took his breath away. Dozens of veterans, all working at computers, organizing documents, preparing what looked like a massive legal case. Some he recognized from the streets, people he'd thought were just homeless addicts or mentally ill. They were neither. They were survivors of something much worse. A young woman approached, her Marine Corps tattoos visible on her forearms. "Sergeant Rodriguez, Marine Intel," she introduced herself. "I've been coordinating with journalists at the Washington Post and New York Times. They're ready to break this story, but they need first-hand accounts, documented evidence, something undeniable. And we have a deadline," Webb added. "Morrison's confirmation hearing is January 3rd. That gives us 11 days to prepare everything." Danny felt overwhelmed. 3 hours ago, he'd been just another homeless veteran trying to survive Christmas in Central Park. Now he was being asked to take on the military-industrial complex's darkest secret. But looking around at the faces watching him, veterans who'd suffered like he had, who'd been betrayed by the country they'd served, he knew he didn't have a choice. "All right," he said. "I'm in. But first I need to get to that storage unit." The journey from Central Park to Brooklyn should have been simple, but Webb insisted on precautions. "Morrison has people watching known veterans who might have information. We'll need to be careful." They equipped Danny with new clothes, making him look like just another New Yorker heading home for the holidays. Rodriguez would accompany him, posing as his girlfriend. Ranger would stay behind, both for his safety and because his presence might trigger recognition from anyone watching for Danny. The subway ride was tense, Danny's hypervigilance in overdrive. Every passenger could be a threat, every delayed stop a potential ambush. Rodriguez kept up a stream of casual chatter, playing her role perfectly, but Danny could see her eyes constantly scanning, her hand never far from the concealed carry piece Webb had provided. The storage facility in Brooklyn looked abandoned, which was why Danny had chosen it. The owner, a Vietnam vet named Tony, asked no questions as long as the cash payment arrived each month. Danny had sacrificed food to keep that payment going, knowing that the documents inside were important even if he hadn't fully understood why. Unit 47 looked undisturbed, but Danny checked for the tiny thread he'd placed in the door jamb. Still there. Inside, behind boxes of his former life, photos, his dress uniform, medals he couldn't bear to look at anymore, was a sealed plastic container with the documents he'd smuggled out of Afghanistan. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez breathed as she read through them. This is worse than we thought. The documents didn't just detail drug experiments. They showed a systematic program of using veterans as test subjects for psychological warfare techniques, memory suppression drugs, and social engineering experiments. Worse, they revealed that the homeless veteran crisis wasn't just a failure of the system. In many cases, it had been deliberately engineered to study the breaking points of human resilience. "We need to get these back to the underground," Rodriguez said. "This changes everything." But as they left the storage facility, Danny's instincts screamed danger. A van had been parked across the street when they arrived. It was still there, engine running despite the cold. 2 men in the front seats trying too hard to look casual. "We're being watched," Danny whispered. Rodriguez nodded slightly. "There's a subway entrance 3 blocks east. Can you run?" "I spent 3 months in these streets. I know every alley, every shortcut." Danny grabbed the document case. "Follow me." They moved casually at first, window shopping, looking like a couple out for last-minute Christmas shopping, but as they turned the corner, Danny broke into a run, pulling Rodriguez into an alley he'd slept in during his first weeks of homelessness. Behind a dumpster was a loose fence panel leading to an abandoned building's courtyard. They could hear pursuit now, footsteps and shouted commands. Danny led them through the building, out a broken window on the other side, across another courtyard, and into the Canal Street subway station. They jumped the turnstile and caught a Manhattan-bound train just as the doors closed, leaving their pursuers on the platform. "That was too close," Rodriguez panted. "They knew we were coming." "Or they've been watching the storage unit," Danny replied. "Either way, Morrison knows we're onto him now." They switched trains twice, doubled back once, and finally emerged at Columbus Circle. The entrance to the underground that Webb had shown them was through a maintenance tunnel in the park, hidden behind a false wall that hadn't been updated on city plans since the 1940s. The underground was in full crisis mode when they returned. Webb had everyone gathering documents, backing up files, preparing for the possibility that their location had been compromised. But there was also an energy, a purpose Danny hadn't felt since his military days. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Webb announced. "If they're actively hunting us, we can't wait until the confirmation hearing. Chen, contact our media allies. Tell them we're going public on Christmas Day. Maximum impact when the whole country is watching feel-good stories." "That's in 2 days," someone protested. "Then we'd better get to work," Webb replied. What followed was 48 hours of intensive preparation that reminded Danny of mission planning in Afghanistan. Veterans with legal backgrounds prepared affidavits. Those with tech skills created secure digital copies of everything. Medical personnel documented physical and psychological damage from the experiments. Everyone had a role. Danny's job was to create a comprehensive narrative from the documents, connecting the dots between disparate experiments and showing the pattern of abuse. As he worked, other veterans shared their stories with him, Each one was heartbreaking. Marcus, a Navy SEAL who'd been given experimental drugs that induced temporary psychosis, then abandoned on the streets of San Diego to see if he'd recover on his own. Jennifer, an Air Force pilot who'd been subjected to sleep deprivation and sensory manipulation to test the limits of human endurance. Tom, an Army medic who'd been infected with designer pathogens to study the psychological effects of chronic illness. They broke us on purpose, Tom said quietly, then studied how we fell apart. Captain Chen had been documenting the medical consequences for years. The suicide rate among veterans from these programs is 400% higher than standard combat veterans, she explained, but officially these programs never existed, so the deaths are just statistics. In December 24th, Christmas Eve, found the underground transformed into a war room. Laptops and phones had been acquired through their network of supporters. Secure communications had been established with journalists in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles. The story would break simultaneously across multiple platforms to prevent any single source from being suppressed. But Danny couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Morrison had been too quiet. No raids on the underground, no legal threats, no attempt to negotiate. It felt like the calm before an ambush. His instincts proved right when Rodriguez intercepted communications from her intelligence contacts. "Morrison's not trying to stop us," she reported. "He's planning to discredit us. He's going to claim we're all mentally ill, that the documents are forgeries created by delusional veterans. He's got psychiatrists ready to testify that we're suffering from mass psychosis." "Son of a bitch," Webb cursed. "He's using our PTSD against us." The room fell silent. It was a brilliant counter-strategy. Who would believe a bunch of homeless veterans with documented mental health issues over a decorated general? "We need third-party verification," Danny said. "Someone with credentials who can validate the documents." "All the officials involved are either dead or on Morrison's payroll," Chen pointed out. Danny stood up, an idea forming. "Not all of them. Rangers program, the enhanced military working dogs. The veterinarian who ran that program, Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She refused to continue the experiments and was forcibly retired. Last I heard, she was teaching at Columbia. Can we trust her?" Webb asked. "She saved Ranger's life when the program wanted to euthanize him for being too independent," Danny replied. "If anyone would stand against Morrison, it's her." Rodriguez was already pulling up information. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell, professor of veterinary neuroscience at Columbia, published multiple papers on the ethics of animal enhancement. And," she paused, "her father was General Robert Mitchell, who opposed Morrison's appointment to his current position before dying in a suspicious car accident 2 years ago. She has her own axe to grind," Webb noted. "Danny, can you and Ranger get to her?" Danny nodded. "If she sees Ranger, she'll listen." The trip to Columbia University on Christmas Eve was surreal. The city was in full holiday mode, tourists everywhere, the sounds of Christmas carols drifting from storefronts. Danny felt disconnected from it all, like he was moving through a different dimension than the celebrating crowds. Dr. Mitchell's campus apartment was in faculty housing near the medical school. Danny had Ranger perform one of his specialized alerts at her door, a specific pattern of scratches that dogs from the program were trained to use. The door opened almost immediately. Sarah Mitchell was in her 50s, with grey-streaked hair and eyes that held both intelligence and sadness. She looked at Ranger, then at Danny, and her expression hardened. "I wondered when someone would come," she said. "Is he okay?" "Ranger? He's fine," Danny assured her. "But we need your help." She listened as Danny explained everything, occasionally asking sharp questions that showed she understood more about the experiments than she'd let on. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I have documentation too," she finally said. "Video recordings of the animal experiments, correspondence between Morrison and the pharmaceutical companies involved, proof that the programs were expanded to human subjects. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to care enough to use it." She led them to a hidden safe behind a bookshelf, pulling out drives and documents that made Danny's evidence look minimal by comparison. "My father started collecting this before he died. He knew Morrison was dangerous, knew what he was capable of. The car accident, it wasn't an accident." "Will you testify?" Danny asked. "I'll do more than that," Sarah replied. "I'll provide medical and scientific validation that the experiments were real, that the damage was intentional, and that Morrison knew exactly what he was doing. But we'll need to be careful. Morrison has reach everywhere." They returned to the underground with Dr. Mitchell and her evidence. The reaction was immediate and electric. With her credentials and documentation, they had the third-party verification they needed. The journalists were ecstatic. The story had gone from questionable to undeniable. Christmas Eve dinner in the underground was unlike anything Danny had experienced. Veterans who'd been broken by their country sat together, sharing a meal and hope for justice. Someone had managed to acquire a small Christmas tree decorated with handmade ornaments. A Marine who'd been a chaplain before the experiments led a non-denominational prayer for strength and healing. Ranger sat beside Danny, occasionally nuzzling veterans who seemed particularly distressed. Dr. Mitchell watched with professional interest. "He really can sense trauma, can't he?" she observed. "The enhancements worked, just not the way they intended. Instead of creating a weapon, they created an empath." "He saved my life," Danny said simply. "More than once. And now he's helping save others," Mitchell replied. "There's poetry in that." At midnight, as Christmas Day officially began, the media embargo lifted. The story exploded across every major news outlet simultaneously. Operation Hometown, how the U.S. military experimented on its own veterans, dominated headlines. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and damning. Danny watched on a laptop as Morrison gave an emergency press conference trying to deny everything. But reporters had the documents, the testimony, the proof. Dr. Mitchell's scientific validation destroyed any attempt to claim mental illness or delusion. Other veterans across the country, seeing the story, began coming forward with their own experiences. By noon on Christmas Day, Morrison had withdrawn from consideration as Secretary of Defense. By evening, criminal investigations had been launched. The Manhattan District Attorney, whose own brother was a veteran, announced that New York would be pressing charges regardless of federal action. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. Throughout Christmas Day, veterans began arriving at the underground, not seeking shelter but offering help. Lawyers volunteering services, doctors providing medical care, business owners offering jobs. The invisible had become visible, and the city was responding. A tech billionaire who'd read the story donated $10 million to convert the underground into an official veteran support center, working with the city to maintain its unique character while providing proper facilities. The abandoned tunnels that had hidden society's discarded warriors would become a monument to their resilience. 3 days after Christmas, Danny stood in the main chamber of the underground, watching as professional contractors worked alongside veterans to improve the space. Ranger was playing with a group of therapy dogs that Dr. Mitchell had brought in. Colonel Webb was coordinating with city officials who'd suddenly discovered they cared about veteran homelessness. "You did this," Captain Chen said, standing beside him. "We all did this," Danny corrected. "What's next for you?" she asked. "You could have any job you want now. The media coverage has made you a hero." Danny thought about it. The storage unit with his old life was still there. He could reclaim his past, try to rebuild what he'd lost. But watching Ranger work with the other veterans, seeing the hope in faces that had been hopeless, he realized he didn't want his old life back. "I think I'll stay," he said. "Help Webb run this place. Make sure no veteran has to sleep in the cold again." Chen smiled. "The Underground Railroad 2.0 continues?" "Something like that, but above ground this time, in the light." As if understanding the conversation, Ranger trotted over, tail wagging. Danny knelt and hugged his partner, his brother, his savior. The dog who'd kept him alive in Afghanistan and on the streets had led him to a purpose he'd never expected. That night, Danny had a bed in a heated room for the first time in months, but he couldn't sleep. He stood at one of the new windows that had been installed, looking out at Central Park, covered in snow. It was beautiful, peaceful, hiding no more secrets in its depths. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Webb entered, followed by someone Danny hadn't expected to see, General Patricia Hayes, in full uniform, someone Danny had served under in Afghanistan before everything went wrong. "Sergeant Reeves," she said formally. Then her expression softened. "Danny, I'm sorry. I'm so goddamned sorry. I knew something was happening to my soldiers, but I didn't know what. I failed you all." "You didn't know about the experiments," Danny said. "I should have pushed harder, investigated more." Hayes pulled out an envelope. "This won't fix anything, but it's a start. Full reinstatement if you want it, back pay, disability rating that reflects what was done to you, and a new position if you're interested. Working with a task force to identify and help other victims of these programs." Danny looked at the envelope, but didn't take it. "I've got a job, right here." Hayes smiled. "I hoped you'd say that. The position can be civilian. You'd be the liaison between the underground and the VA, making sure veterans get what they need without the bureaucracy that failed them before. This Danny could accept. A bridge between the world that had broken them and the community that had saved them. He took the envelope. After Hayes left, Danny found himself back in the main chamber where a Christmas party was still ongoing. Veterans and supporters, underground dwellers and city officials, all mixing in a way that would have been impossible a week ago. Rodriguez was teaching some young veterans cybersecurity. Dr. Mitchell was examining dogs, identifying others from the enhancement program. Webb was holding court with city planners, describing his vision for the space. But it was the wall of photos that drew Danny's attention. Pictures of veterans who'd passed through the underground over the decades. Some who'd made it, some who hadn't. Webb had added Danny's photo, and beside it, one of Ranger. "Heroes, both of them," the inscription read. "We should add more," Danny said to Webb. "Every veteran who comes through. Their story matters." "Already ordered the cameras," Webb replied. "This place is about memory as much as healing. Remembering those who served, those who suffered, those who survived." The party continued late into the night, but eventually Danny needed air. He and Ranger walked out into Central Park, no longer hiding, no longer invisible. The snow had started falling again, gentle flakes that covered the tracks of the past week's frantic activity. They walked to the spot where Danny had been sleeping just days ago, near the Bow Bridge. It seemed like a lifetime had passed. Other homeless individuals were there, huddled against the cold. Danny recognized some of them, not all veterans, but all forgotten by the city around them. He pulled out his phone and called Webb. "We need to expand the mission, not just veterans. Anyone who needs help. That's a big undertaking," Webb warned. "We have a big space, and a city that's finally paying attention." As Danny headed back to the underground, Ranger, suddenly alert beside him, he saw them. More veterans, drawn by the news coverage, seeking help. A young woman with a prosthetic arm, an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran hat, a middle-aged woman whose eyes held the 1,000-yard stare Danny knew too well. "Welcome," Danny said to each of them. "You're safe now. You're home." The underground's entrance, once hidden and secret, was now marked with a simple sign: "No veteran walks alone." But Danny knew it would soon need to say more. No one walks alone, because that was the real lesson of the underground, that beneath the surface of the city, beneath the divisions and indifference, there was a network of humanity waiting to be activated. Over the following weeks, the underground transformed rapidly. The city fast-tracked permits, waiving usual requirements in the face of public pressure. Donations poured in from across the country. Veterans with construction skills worked alongside professional contractors, building proper facilities while maintaining the character of the space. Danny found himself at the center of it all, coordinating between the old guard like Webb and the new resources flooding in. His military training, which had seemed useless on the streets, proved invaluable in organizing the chaos into something functional. Ranger became the unofficial therapy dog for the entire operation, somehow always knowing who needed him most. Dr. Mitchell established a veterinary clinic specifically for the service dogs of homeless veterans, many of whom had sacrificed their own meals to feed their companions. She also began documenting the other enhanced dogs from the program, finding that many had ended up with homeless veterans through what seemed like coincidence, but was probably something more. Rodriguez set up a cybersecurity center, teaching veterans skills that were in high demand, while also protecting the underground's digital infrastructure. She discovered that Morrison's network was extensive, with connections throughout the military-industrial complex, and that taking him down was just the beginning. Captain Chen expanded the medical facility, bringing in volunteer doctors and nurses. She instituted a no-questions-asked policy for treatment, understanding that many veterans had reasons to avoid official channels. The facility became known as the safest place in the city for veterans to get help without judgment. The legal ramifications of the scandal continued to ripple outward. Morrison was arrested on federal charges, but more importantly, the entire system that had enabled the experiments came under scrutiny. Congressional hearings were scheduled. The VA announced massive reforms. The president issued an executive order requiring full transparency in all veteran medical programs. But for Danny, the most important changes were the small ones. The veteran who smiled for the first time in years, the service dog reunited with medical care, the family who thought their loved one was dead, discovering they were alive and getting help. These individual victories mattered more than any headline. One evening in late January, as Danny was finishing paperwork in his new office, Webb knocked on the door. "You need to see this," he said, leading Danny to the archive room. They'd been digitizing all the historical records, and a volunteer had discovered something remarkable. In documents from the 1920s, there was mention of a Daniel Reeves who'd helped establish the underground after World War I. Danny's great-grandfather, whom he'd never known existed. "Your family has been connected to this place for 100 years, Webb said. "Different wars, same mission. Seems like you were always meant to find your way here." Danny stared at the old photograph of a man who looked remarkably like him, standing in what was recognizably the same chamber, surrounded by fellow veterans. The cycle of service, sacrifice, and salvation continuing through generations. "There's more," Webb continued. "Your great-grandfather's journal. He wrote about a vision for the underground, that one day it wouldn't be hidden, that veterans would be honored rather than hidden away. Took a century, but you made his vision real." That night, Danny sat in his small apartment within the underground complex. They'd built proper living spaces for the permanent staff, reading his great-grandfather's journal. Ranger lay at his feet, occasionally sighing contentedly. The words from 100 years ago resonated perfectly. We who have seen war's true face cannot explain it to those who haven't, but we can recognize each other. We can stand together. We can ensure that no one who served stands alone in the darkness. This underground is more than shelter. It's proof that brotherhood forged in battle doesn't end with discharge papers. Someday I pray we won't need to hide. Someday the wounded warriors will be welcomed in the light. A knock interrupted his reading. Sarah Chen, no relation to Captain Chen, stood at his door. She was a social worker who'd started volunteering after the Christmas Day revelation, and over the past month she and Danny had grown close. She understood his struggles without needing explanation, having lost her brother in Iraq. "The mayor's here," she said. "Wants to do a photo op. Webb's keeping him busy, but he specifically asked for you and Ranger." Danny sighed. The political attention was necessary but exhausting. Everyone wanted to be seen supporting veterans now that it was safe and popular. But if it brought resources to those who needed them, He'd smile for every camera in the city. The photo op was predictably staged, the mayor presenting a ceremonial key to the city to Danny and Webb, while Ranger sat perfectly at attention. But afterward, the mayor pulled Danny aside. "I need your help," he said quietly. "The homelessness crisis isn't just veterans. The techniques you've developed here, the community building, the trust networks, could they work for others?" Danny thought about the other invisible people he'd lived among on the streets. The families, the mentally ill, the addicts, the people who'd simply fallen through society's cracks. "It could work," he said, "but it would need to be organic, led by the community itself, not imposed from above." "Design it," the mayor said. "Whatever resources you need, the underground model, expanded citywide." It was an enormous request, but Danny found himself nodding. The underground had taught him that impossible things became possible when people simply decided to see and serve each other. February brought unexpected challenges. Some veterans, institutionalized by years of homelessness, struggled with the structure and community of the underground. Others, dealing with severe PTSD, found the crowded conditions triggering. Danny worked with Dr. Mitchell and Captain Chen to develop individualized programs, understanding that one size didn't fit all in recovery. There were also those who tried to exploit the underground's success. Fake veterans seeking services, politicians wanting photo ops without providing real support, contractors overcharging because they knew the funding was available. Danny learned to navigate these challenges, developing a healthy cynicism while maintaining the open-door policy that made the underground special. The most difficult challenge came when they discovered that not all the veterans from Morrison's experiments wanted the truth exposed. Some had built new lives and didn't want their past dragged into the light. Others feared retribution from Morrison's remaining network. Danny had to balance justice with individual privacy, a complex ethical challenge that kept him awake many nights. Through it all, Ranger remained his constant companion and guide. The dog seemed to age in reverse, growing younger and more energetic as he worked with the increasing number of therapy dogs at the underground. Dr. Mitchell theorized that the enhancements had given him not just sensory improvements, but increased longevity, though she couldn't explain the mechanism. One morning in March, Danny woke to find Ranger pouring at the door urgently. Following the dog, Danny discovered a young veteran named Marcus collapsed in the tunnel entrance, overdosed on opioids. While Captain Chen worked to save his life, Danny held the young man's hand, remembering his own darkest moments on the streets. Marcus survived, and his story became a catalyst for adding addiction services to the underground's programs. Dr. Mitchell brought in addiction specialists who understood the unique relationship between combat trauma and substance abuse. The program had a higher success rate than traditional rehab, perhaps because it addressed the underlying wounds rather than just the symptoms. Spring brought new growth in more ways than one. The city approved an expansion of the underground, connecting it to abandoned subway tunnels that could house hundreds more. A community garden was established in Central Park, tended by veterans who found peace in growing things after years of destruction. Job training programs expanded to include not just technology, but traditional trades, recognizing that not everyone healed the same way. Danny and Sarah Chen's relationship deepened, though both were cautious, carrying their own wounds. She understood his night terrors, his hypervigilance, his need for control. He understood her grief, her fear of loss, her desperate need to help others as a way of honoring her brother. Together, they found a balance, each supporting the other's healing. The one-year anniversary of Danny's discovery of the underground approached with media requests flooding in. Everyone wanted to tell the story of the Christmas miracle, the homeless veteran who'd exposed a conspiracy and transformed a city's approach to homelessness. But Danny was tired of being the story. He wanted the focus on the ongoing work, not the dramatic origin. He agreed to one interview with a journalist who'd been embedded with troops in Afghanistan and understood the complexity of veteran issues. She spent a week at the underground, talking to dozens of veterans, documenting the daily work rather than just the dramatic moments. Her piece, when it ran, captured something most missed, that the underground's real miracle wasn't the exposure of Morrison's crimes, but the daily choice of broken people to help each other heal. December 23rd, exactly 1 year after Danny had first entered the underground, found him standing in the same tunnel entrance. But everything had changed. The tunnel was well lit now, with proper ventilation and heating. The chamber that had once hidden dozens now openly served hundreds. The secret had become a beacon. Ranger sat beside him, alert as always, but relaxed in a way he'd never been on the streets. They'd both found home in the most unexpected place. As Danny watched veterans arrive for the anniversary celebration, some walking proudly, others still tentative, he felt the satisfaction of mission accomplished, mixed with the understanding that the mission would never truly end. Webb approached, moving slower than he had a year ago, but still commanding respect. "You've done good, son," he said simply, "better than I ever imagined." "We've done good," Danny corrected. "All of us." "True enough. But you were the catalyst, the one who brought it all into the light." That evening's anniversary celebration was bittersweet. They remembered those who hadn't made it, veterans who died on the streets before the underground could find them. But they also celebrated those who'd been saved, who'd found purpose and community in the most unlikely place. Dr. Mitchell presented her research on the enhanced military dogs, showing how their abilities could be used therapeutically rather than tactically. Rodriguez announced that her cybersecurity training program had placed 50 veterans in high-paying jobs. Captain Chen revealed plans for a mobile medical unit that would bring underground services to those who couldn't make it to Central Park. As midnight approached, Danny found himself back in the archive room, looking at the wall of photographs that now covered every surface. Thousands of faces, each representing a story of service, struggle, and survival. His own photo was there, along with Rangers, no more or less important than any other. Sarah Chen found him there, slipping her hand into his. "Thinking about the past year?" she asked. "Thinking about the next year," Danny replied. "And all the years after that. This work doesn't end." "No," she agreed, "but that's what makes it important." Ranger barked softly, drawing their attention to the entrance where a new arrival stood uncertainly. A young woman in an army uniform, fresh from deployment, with the hollow eyes Danny recognized too well. Without hesitation, he walked over to her. "Welcome to the underground," he said gently. "You're safe here. You're among family." As he led her inside, explaining the resources available, introducing her to other female veterans who could relate to her specific challenges, Danny realized this was his true calling. Not the dramatic exposé of corruption, not the media attention or political influence, but this simple act of welcoming the wounded home. Christmas Eve arrived with a snowstorm that reminded Danny of the night he'd discovered the underground. But now, instead of seeking shelter from the cold, he was helping organize a feast for 300 veterans and their families. The main chamber had been decorated by volunteers, a massive Christmas tree standing where shadows once hid society's forgotten warriors. The celebration was interrupted by unexpected visitors. General Hayes arrived with several other high-ranking officers, both active and retired. They weren't there for publicity or politics, but to apologize. One by one, they stood before the assembled veterans and acknowledged the failures, the betrayals, the times they'd chosen career over conscience. It was Colonel Marcus Webb who responded for the group. "We don't need apologies," he said firmly. "We need action. We need you to ensure this never happens again. We need you to fight for us in the halls of power the way we fought for this country in places most Americans can't even pronounce." The officers pledged to do exactly that, and Danny believed them. The exposure of Morrison's experiments had shaken the military establishment to its core. Real reform was happening, slowly but steadily. As the evening progressed, Danny noticed Ranger exhibiting unusual behavior. The dog was moving through the crowd with purpose, stopping at specific veterans, performing his alert signal. Dr. Mitchell watched with interest, then understanding dawned on her face. "He's identifying others from the enhancement program," she explained. "Other dogs and their handlers. They're drawn here, just like you were." By the end of the night, they'd identified 7 other enhanced dogs and their veteran handlers, all of whom had found their way to the underground through different paths. It was statistically impossible, unless something more than chance was at work. The program tried to create weapons, Dr. Mitchell mused. Instead, it created a network of healers. The dogs don't just sense trauma, they're drawn to help heal it, and they're drawing their handlers together to multiply that healing. Christmas Day dawned clear and bright. Danny stood on the roof of the building above the underground, a space that had been converted into a greenhouse where veterans grew vegetables for the community kitchen. From here, he could see Central Park spread out below, no longer a place of hiding, but of belonging. Ranger stood beside him, and Danny noticed the dog was looking at something specific. Following his gaze, Danny saw them, small groups of people throughout the park, some obviously homeless, others just lonely, all isolated on Christmas morning. Without discussion, Danny and Ranger headed down to invite them to the feast. This became the pattern of the day. Veterans from the underground spread throughout the city, finding the forgotten and inviting them home. By afternoon, the underground hosted not just veterans, but anyone who needed community on Christmas. The space that had once hidden society's invisible people now openly embraced them. Among the guests was an unexpected visitor, Morrison's daughter, Jennifer. She'd been disowned by her family for speaking out against her father, left with nothing but her conscience. Danny found her crying in a corner, overwhelmed by being in the place her father had tried to destroy. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry for what he did." It was Marcus, the young veteran who'd overdosed and been saved, who approached her. "You're not responsible for your father's crimes," he said gently, "but you're welcome to help us heal from them." Jennifer would become one of the underground's most dedicated volunteers, using her insider knowledge of the military-industrial complex to help veterans navigate the system that had betrayed them. As the sun set on Christmas Day, Danny conducted what had become a daily ritual, the reading of names. Every veteran who died on the streets that year, every suicide, every overdose, every death that might have been prevented. It was a sobering reminder that despite their successes, the work was far from over. But then came the other list. Those saved, those housed, those employed, those reunited with families, those who'd found purpose. This list was longer and growing every day. The balance was shifting from tragedy to hope. That night, after the crowds had dispersed and the underground had settled into quiet, Danny walked through the tunnels with Ranger. They passed the medical facility where Captain Chen was treating a veteran who'd just arrived, the computer lab where Rodriguez was teaching night classes, the kennels where Dr. Mitchell was caring for service dogs whose handlers were in treatment. In the main chamber, Webb sat with a group of Vietnam veterans, sharing stories and bourbon, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. The archive room held researchers documenting every story, ensuring nothing would be forgotten. The dormitories housed dozens who would have been on the streets, warm and safe and surrounded by people who understood. Danny's phone buzzed with a message from the mayor. The city council had approved funding to replicate the underground model in all 5 boroughs. The federal government was considering a national program. What had started as a hidden sanctuary for a few dozen veterans was becoming a movement that could transform how America cared for its most vulnerable citizens. But Danny wasn't thinking about the big picture tonight. He was thinking about the young woman who'd arrived that evening, the new veterans who would find their way here tomorrow, the ongoing daily work of healing and hope. If you've been moved by this story of transformation and redemption, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these powerful stories that remind us all of our capacity for resilience and our responsibility to each other, especially during the holiday season when no one should be forgotten. The year that followed saw the Underground's model spread across the country. Cities from Los Angeles to Boston established their own versions, each adapted to local needs, but maintaining the core principle. Those who'd been broken by service to their country deserved more than charity. They deserved community, purpose, and the chance to serve again in meaningful ways. Danny traveled frequently now, consulting with cities trying to establish their own programs. Ranger always accompanied him, the dog's presence lending credibility and comfort in equal measure. They'd become symbols of hope, though Danny remained uncomfortable with the attention. In each city, they found the same hidden populations of veterans, the same networks of mutual support operating in shadows, the same potential waiting to be activated. The Underground model worked because it wasn't imposed from above, but grew from within, led by those who'd lived the experience. Sarah Chen, whom Danny had married in a small ceremony in the Underground's main chamber, traveled with him when she could. Her expertise in trauma counseling proved invaluable in training staff for new facilities. Together, they were building not just shelters, but healing communities. The legal proceedings against Morrison and his co-conspirators continued, revealing ever deeper levels of corruption and abuse. Each revelation brought new veterans forward, people who'd suffered in silence for decades, finally able to name what had been done to them. The Underground network became their sanctuary, offering not just services, but understanding. Dr. Mitchell's research into the enhanced dogs led to breakthrough treatments for PTSD. The dog's ability to sense and respond to trauma was studied and replicated through training programs. Within 2 years, thousands of veterans had specially trained service dogs, dramatically reducing suicide rates and improving quality of life. Rodriguez's cybersecurity program evolved into a full technical college for veterans, offering certifications in high-demand fields. The placement rate was nearly perfect, with tech companies actively recruiting from the program. Veterans who'd felt useless in civilian life discovered their military skills translated perfectly to protecting digital infrastructure. Captain Chen's medical model influenced VA reform nationwide. The principle of no questions asked care, of treating the whole person rather than just symptoms, of addressing moral injury alongside physical wounds, became the new standard. She testified before Congress, her prosthetic legs and military bearing lending authority to her words. Webb, despite his advancing age, remained the spiritual heart of the Underground. His ability to connect with veterans from any era, to make each person feel seen and valued, was irreplaceable. He was documenting the Underground's history, ensuring future generations would understand both the failures that made it necessary and the love that made it possible. 3 years after that first Christmas in Central Park, Danny stood in the White House Rose Garden, receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, alongside Webb, Chen, Rodriguez, and Dr. Mitchell. Ranger, wearing a special service vest for the occasion, sat at perfect attention. The president spoke about courage, service, and the power of community to heal wounds that seemed unhealable. But even as he stood there, Danny's mind was on the work still to be done. Veterans were still dying on the streets. The system, though improved, still failed too many. The Underground and its sister sites were treating symptoms of deeper problems that required societal change, not just individual intervention. After the ceremony, a young Marine approached Danny. She'd lost her leg in Syria and was struggling with the transition to civilian life. The VA had helped with her physical rehabilitation, but the spiritual wounds remained raw. Could the Underground help? "We don't just help," Danny told her. "We invite you to help others. That's where the real healing happens." She became one of the Underground's most effective peer counselors, her youth and recent service allowing her to connect with the newest generation of veterans. Watching her transform from wounded to healer reminded Danny of his own journey. The fifth anniversary of Danny's discovery of the underground was marked not with celebration, but with service. Veterans from the network spent the day reaching out to those still isolated, still suffering. They searched the parks, the underpasses, the forgotten corners where America's warriors hid their wounds. They found them. They always did. Sometimes it was Ranger or one of the other enhanced dogs who located them. Sometimes it was the network of formerly homeless veterans who knew all the hiding spots. Sometimes it was family members who'd heard about the underground and begged for help finding their lost loved ones. Each rescue was a victory, but Danny had learned not to expect miracles. Recovery was slow, non-linear, often frustrating. Some veterans came to the underground multiple times before they were ready to stay. Others found what they needed in a single visit. There was no one-size-fits-all solution to trauma, only the patient offering of community and purpose to those ready to receive it. One evening, Danny received an unexpected visitor. Morrison, out on bail while appealing his conviction, came to the underground. He was smaller than Danny remembered, diminished by disgrace and the weight of his crimes. He didn't ask for forgiveness or understanding, just the chance to see what his experiments had ultimately created. Danny could have refused, but something made him agree. He showed Morrison through the facility, letting him see the veterans finding healing, the community that had grown from suffering. Morrison said nothing during the tour, but Danny saw tears on his face when they passed the memorial wall listing those who died from the experiments. "I thought I was serving my country," Morrison finally said. "I thought the research would help future soldiers." "You were serving yourself," Danny replied without sympathy. "But your victims chose to serve each other. That's the difference between us." Morrison left without another word, but a week later his lawyer delivered a package. Inside were documents Morrison had hidden, detailing other experimental programs, other victims who might need help. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. Using Morrison's information, the underground network found and helped hundreds more veterans who'd been subjects in classified experiments. Each revelation brought new anger, but also new opportunities for healing. The network grew stronger with each person saved, each story shared, each connection made. Danny's own healing continued in unexpected ways. The nightmares that had plagued him for years became less frequent, replaced sometimes by dreams of the future rather than memories of the past. His hypervigilance evolved from a symptom to a tool, allowing him to spot veterans in crisis before they reached breaking point. His relationship with Sarah deepened into something he'd never thought possible after war: true peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. She knew when he needed space, when he needed touch, when he needed to talk, and when he needed silence. Their love was built on mutual brokenness and mutual strength. When Sarah told him she was pregnant, Danny felt both joy and terror. Bringing a child into a world that could break people so thoroughly seemed impossibly optimistic. But surrounded by the community of the underground, by people who'd survived the worst and chosen to help others do the same, he found hope. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, with Ranger standing guard outside the delivery room. They named her Hope, not for naive optimism, but for the determined choice to believe in better possibilities despite evidence to the contrary. She would grow up in the underground, surrounded by wounded healers who would teach her that strength wasn't about being unbreakable, but about helping others when you yourself were broken. As Danny held his daughter for the first time, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a broken soldier sleeping rough in Central Park to the father of a movement that had transformed how America cared for its veterans. It seemed impossible, but then the underground had taught him that impossible things happened when people simply decided to see and serve each other. Ranger, now showing his age but still alert, came to inspect the new addition to their pack. The dog approved, gently licking Hope's tiny hand. Another generation under his protection, another future to guard. The enhancement program had tried to create a weapon, but had instead created a guardian. There was poetry in that. as Dr. Mitchell often said. 10 years after that first Christmas in Central Park, the underground was unrecognizable from its origins. The network spread across the country, serving not just veterans, but anyone who'd been broken by service to others. First responders, healthcare workers, teachers who'd given everything and been left with nothing. The model of peer support, of the wounded healing the wounded, proved universally effective. Danny, now with grey threading through his hair, stood in the original chamber, giving a tour to new volunteers. He showed them the photographs, the archives, the history of a place that had existed in shadow for over a century before being brought into the light. He told them about Colonel Webb, who'd passed the previous year, but whose spirit permeated every stone. About Captain Chen, who now ran the medical program nationwide. About Rodriguez, whose cybersecurity firm employed hundreds of veterans. About Dr. Mitchell, whose research had revolutionized trauma treatment. But mostly, he told them about the individual veterans. Marcus, who'd gone from overdose to counselor. Jennifer Morrison, who'd transformed her father's shame into service. The countless others who'd found their way from darkness to light, then turned back to guide others along the same path. Ranger had passed 3 years earlier, peacefully, surrounded by the community he'd helped create. His ashes were scattered in Central Park, returning him to the place where he'd led Danny to salvation. Other dogs from the enhancement program carried on his work, their unusual abilities now properly understood and channeled toward healing. A new dog worked alongside Danny now, a young German shepherd named Scout, who'd shown the same empathic abilities as Ranger. Perhaps she was descended from the enhancement program, or perhaps some dogs were simply born healers. Either way, she carried on Ranger's legacy of finding the lost and guiding them home. Hope, now 9 years old, often accompanied Danny on his rounds. She'd grown up considering veterans not as broken people to be pitied, but as family members to be loved. Her normal was a community of mutual support, where everyone had scars and everyone had strength. She would carry the underground's mission into the future, long after Danny and his generation were gone. The Christmas season still held special significance for the underground. Every year, they opened their doors wider, reaching out to anyone alone in the cold. The memorial service for those lost had grown into a citywide event, with the mayor, governor, and sometimes even the president attending. But the heart of it remained the same. Veterans caring for veterans, the broken helping the broken, the invisible making themselves seen. On this particular Christmas Eve, a decade after his first night in the underground, Danny received a call that brought his journey full circle. A veteran was in crisis in Central Park, exactly where Danny had once slept. Armed and paranoid, he was considered dangerous by the police who'd surrounded him at a distance. Danny arrived with Scout and Sarah, approaching slowly, hands visible. The veteran was young, recently returned from deployment, with the same 1,000-yard stare Danny had once seen in his own mirror. He held a pistol, not threatening anyone, but clearly ready to use it on himself. "I know you," Danny said calmly. "Not your name, but I know you. I've been you. That bench you're sitting on, I slept there. That gun in your hand. I held one just like it, trying to decide if ending the pain was worth it." The young man's eyes focused on Danny for the first time. "You don't understand what I did over there, what I saw. I can't live with it." "You can't live with it alone," Danny corrected. "But you don't have to. There's a place not far from here. People who understand without you having to explain. Not charity, not pity, but community. Family." It took 3 hours of patient talking, but eventually the young man lowered the gun. Danny walked him to the underground personally, Scout leading the way just as Ranger once had. The cycle continued. The saved becoming saviors, the healed becoming healers. As Christmas Day dawned over Central Park, Danny stood where he'd once hidden in shame and desperation. Now he stood proudly, surrounded by family of choice and circumstance. The underground glowed with warmth and welcome beneath their feet, no longer hidden, but still mysterious, still powerful, still saving lives one broken warrior at a time. The secret under the snow had been more than hidden tunnels and forgotten veterans. It had been the potential for transformation that exists in the darkest moments, the possibility of purpose that emerges from pain, the truth that sometimes being broken is the first step toward becoming whole in a different way. Danny looked at his daughter, his wife, his community, and felt the kind of peace he'd never thought possible when he was sleeping on that bench. Not the peace of a life without struggle, but the peace of struggle shared, of purpose found, of service continued in a different battlefield. The underground would continue long after Danny was gone, he knew. Other veterans would discover it in their darkest hours. Other dogs would lead the lost home. Other secrets would be revealed, other corruptions exposed, other healing communities built. The work would never end, but neither would the love that powered it. As snow began to fall again on Central Park, covering the paths and hiding the entrances just as it had that night 10 years ago, Danny smiled. Let it snow. Let it hide. Those who needed to find the underground would find it, led by instinct or angels or enhanced dogs who knew more than they should. And when they arrived, they would find what Danny had found, not just shelter from the storm, but the chance to become the shelter for others. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Every day brought new veterans in crisis, new challenges to overcome, new opportunities to prove that the broken could become beautiful, the wounded could become wise, and the lost could lead others home. This was the true secret under the snow, that redemption was possible, that purpose could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the best way to save yourself was to save others. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey with Danny and Ranger through the hidden heart of New York City. If this story touched your soul, reminded you of the veterans in your own life, or opened your eyes to the invisible struggles of those who served, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything and helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of redemption, community, and hope. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when our next story drops. And remember, this holiday season and always, look for the invisible among us, offer help without judgment, and believe in the power of community to heal wounds that seem unhealable. Until next time, hold space for those who are struggling. And remember that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply seeing someone who's gotten used to being invisible.